Hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County, coming to you today from Pearl River County. And again, I appreciate them providing some space for me. We're still waiting for power to come back in some areas down in Hancock County. But all in all, we're doing all right. And I appreciate everyone joining me today. Today's presentation is going to be an introduction to plant taxonomy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the diversity of plants that are out there. And it's kind of an interesting topic. There is a huge diversity in plants and the way that they interact with the environment. And so I want to stress that today really does serve just as a bare introduction to the topic. There really does merit a lot more exploration that I can give it in this format. And I hope in the near future, I'll be able to pick out some of the groups that I talk about today and give some more in-depth talks about that particular group and the fascinating things that are involved in that particular smaller group of plants. Again, thank you for being here. If you are watching on YouTube, I would appreciate it. If you have any questions, you can just put those down in the comment area of the YouTube video. I will see those comments, and if as soon as I can, I will be happy to send you a reply to that question so that you can be a part of this. If you would like to be notified when future videos are being put out, there is a little subscribe button down in the bottom. You can hit that subscribe button, and whenever I upload new videos, you'll get a notification for that to let you know that you've got something new to watch. So again, we're just going to do a very very over the surface introduction to the diversity there is in the plant kingdom. And so I want to start off just kind of talking about the idea of taxonomy. Taxonomy is just the practice of giving things names, of grouping things into meaningful categories for us. And when we talk about taxonomy, we talk about the different levels of classification that we use. And since I'm talking about plants today, I'm going to use a plant as my example to discuss this. To start off with, we have the kingdom. And kingdoms, at least when I was in school, and I know it's changed a little bit since then, I got taught that there were 5. I understand other systems of taxonomy have been developed that break things down a little bit differently. But the plantae, or plantae make up one kingdom. They're defined by their ability to photosynthesize, several other categories, several other characteristics that all group all of these different plants into the kingdom Plantae. Beneath that, we have the phylum, and when we're talking about plants, sometimes the word division gets used instead of phylum. But again, that is a really, really big group. And here, for the example, we have the kingdom Plantae, and then the phylum Tracheophyta. And Tracheophyta includes all of the vascular plants. So if it's got that vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem cells that we learn about when we're learning about how water and nutrients and sugars move around a plant, it's going to be in that group Tracheophyta. Down from that, we have the Magnoliophyta, which tells you that it's going to be a flowering plant. And then, again, it gets more and more specific. So you wind up, you have the order Fagales, the family Fagaceae, and many of you will recognize the name of the genus Quercus, and then, of course, the species Quercus virginiana. It's always important, one thing that people get kind of confused about is the species name is going to be the genus name plus that specific epithet at the end. So sometimes you'll see instead of species, it'll say specific epithet. But when you say the species name, you want to say those two things together. There's a lot of different species out there that have an end, like Virginiana or Americana or things like that. So you always want to say the genus name and the specific epithet together. Usually those are written in italics because they're all Latin or Greek. But Quercus virginiana would be the live oak that we're so fond of down here in coastal Mississippi. And you see a nice picture of that there. So all of that gives us a lot of information about that plant because we understand what those different groups are comprised of, and other things that are in that group are going to have really similar characteristics, more and more so as we get into these smaller and smaller groups of classification, from kingdom all the way down to species. And we always learn some sort of mnemonic to remember that group. I learned a few along the way, like kings play chess on fine grained sand, or King Philip came over from Germany, saw Indians, and I would be for individual. But however you remember it is perfectly okay. But that's how we group things. And there are all sorts of different plants that have sort of a common origin going back to what we're pretty sure is a kind of green algae that would be the most primitive or the furthest back, the common ancestor of our plants. And we group them together based on, again, the common characteristics. And as we get into the modern era and we have better tools to examine the genome of plants, the genetic information in their cells, we can group plants together based on genetic similarity, in addition to the common characteristics that they share. Of course, most of the time those things go very closely together, but understanding that genetic background has allowed us to really look at how those groups interrelate over time, and we can kind of trace back how those changes were made. So you can see the ancestral green algae, and you have one line off of that with all of the non-vascular plants, and we'll talk about some groups there. And then the start of the vascular plants, and then the seed plants as a further specialization and further branches in that tree. So what we wind up looking at when we look at all of the plants, by no stretch of the imagination, all of them, but the major groups of plants, is we have the one big group, we have those non-vascular plants that are going to include things like the hornworts and mosses and liverworts and those green algae. And dependent on who you talk to and what taxonomist is putting things together, the red algae may or may not be included within the kingdom Plantae. Taxonomists have to have things to argue over to keep things interesting. So then we have the vascular plants. Again, those are going to have that those xylem and phloem cells, and we call that, if we want to use the fancy name for it, it'd be the tracheobionta. And within those, there are going to be all sorts of different divisions, including the horsetails and lycopods, whisk ferns, and important for us in landscape plants, the ferns themselves. Then we get to the seed-bearing plants, the spermatophyta, and we have the conifers. So that would be pine trees and junipers and things like that. We have the cycadophyta, which would be our cycads, think sago palm. Ginkgophyta, ginkgo is in a group all by itself. The Gnetophyta, which includes some plants you may not have run into, but some interesting ones that we're going to discuss very briefly. And the one that we're probably the most familiar with is going to be the Magnoliophyta, or the flowering plants, that we group down into the Monocots and the Dicots, or the Liliopsida and Magnoliopsida as the divisions there. And over the course of the next few minutes, we are just going to kind of go through some of these categories and talk about them and kind of what makes them distinct from the other plants that you might encounter. And along the way, you might see some that you weren't familiar with, and I always think that that's really interesting. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the non-vascular plants. The most important distinction for these non-vascular plants is, of course, that they don't have specialized tissues in the plant that allow for the transport of water and for nutrients. As a result of that, generally speaking, these plants are going to be quite small. They're not going to be able to grow up to be very large because they're not going to be able to transport water through a big plant. So they tend to be low-lying, and they also tend to be found in areas where there's a fair amount of moisture, both because they need that to be able to take it in, and also because of the way that they tend to reproduce. So again, the most important factor here is they don't have specialized cells for water transport. That's really what defines this group. Now, the one we're going to be most familiar with are the mosses. We see these growing in our yard sometime, particularly if we have a wet area or underneath a tree. Again, they're not going to have flowers. If you see the top middle picture up there, there's a moss, and it has all these little things coming up from that. Of course, it forms this nice dense mat of plant tissue. And then they send up those, and those actually have spores on them. And that is how that plant is going to reproduce, is by the movement of those spores. And it generally is going to require water in order to do that. Generally, really simple plant, just going to be composed of simple leaves. Those leaves are very, very thin. They're just one cell thick, and they do have spores instead of seeds. Now, you can see a picture of a liverwort there in the top left of your screen. And really, they resemble mosses a great deal. They tend to have larger sort of flat leaf shapes as opposed to what we would think about for the mosses. And green algae we tend to find growing in our ponds and things like that. There is a whole lot of diversity of green algae, but again, it's an aquatic plant. Some of it is going to be just kind of in little single cells kind of floating on the surface of the water. Sometimes we'll also see filamentous algae that is attached down to the bottom of the pond in long strands that can be a kind of a nuisance to pond owners. Red algae, very similar to the green algae. And if I keep pronouncing algae with a hard G like that, it's because my microbiology professor a long time ago did. But oftentimes you'll generally hear people in the United States say algae rather than algae. So I apologize for that little idiosyncrasy in my pronunciation. Of course, red algae is going to have that really nice red color to it. And again, taxonomists really kind of argue over whether that's going to be in the plant group at all. But these are the non-vascular plants. Mosses actually, again, I often get phone calls from clients asking me how to get rid of mosses in the landscape, because they tend to show up in lawns, particularly in wet areas or shaded areas where the grass isn't performing very well. And often to me, I'm not certain if I think I really want to remove the moss at all. I think it works very well as a ground cover in those areas where grass might not be the most suitable thing. But it can be a little bit of nuisance if you have that wet area. And really the important thing to do to get rid of it, if you have a problem with it, is to address why that area might have an awful lot of shade or might have excess water. And because of that, the grass isn't performing very well. Kind of on the other side of that, moss does actually make a really pretty ground cover. And you can see this nice pathway in the picture there on the right, where they've got that sort of lined path with moss growing in amongst the rocks. And it really can be an attractive addition to areas in the landscape and will grow really, really well if you have a wet area as an excellent ground cover. So just something to keep in mind is something that we can add into our landscape to fit the plants that we use in our landscape to the environment rather than trying to fit the environment to the plants. Moving on from that, we get to the first of the vascular plants that we're going to talk about. These are the horsetails, or the Equistophyta. Equus would be the Latin word for horse, Latin Greek. I'm terrible at this. Phyta would be plant. And what we see in the Equistophyta, or the horsetails, are segmented hollow stems. If you can kind of think of the appearance that you might see out of bamboo, bamboo is not in this group. I'm just kind of using it as an example. But the plants have that segmented appearance, have hollow stems. Sometimes there will be a pith material in the center of that. And there will generally be a whorl of leaves at the junction of each of those segments. So you can see that up there in the top right, really close in, where it has all of those leaves coming up there. If we go back a really, really long way through the fossil record, then we can find some examples of fossils in this group that are quite large, that have secondary growth. So they're quite large plants. Nowadays, they're all herbaceous. They're all very small plants. And they grow up in 1 year. And interestingly, they don't really have roots like you would see in the sort of plants that we think about usually. It really just is just kind of a jointed rhizome or jointed stem underneath the ground that they collect all of their water and nutrients for them. They bear a cone-like structure. It's not a cone like that you would see in the conifers. Technical term for it is a strobolus, or strobili would be the plural. And those are right up at the tips of those stems. You can see that in the middle picture on the top. And I had a question in the chat area about controlling horsetails. It's not common that you would see these in your home environment. I suppose things like that are possible, but they're really, really uncommon to see that in a home environment. You might have other plants that we call similar things like that, but they do tend to respond to some herbicides that we could use if you were trying to control them. And anytime I would make a recommendation like that, I'd probably ask you to send me a picture just to make sure that we were talking about the same thing. They can be used ornamentally. So you can see there kind of at the edge of the deck, the use of these horsetails kind of as the same way that we would use cane in the environment. I actually think the strobili are actually kind of neat looking and add kind of an interesting thing that sort of visual pop to them. You can see a picture there on the right. So some of these I guess primitive plants do perform quite well in the landscape and can be used to add just kind of something different that you might not see every day. We also have the club mosses. They look a lot like mosses. They're called club mosses because they send up that little shoot that has that kind of club-like structure on them. They're perennial. They stick around for years, and they stay green throughout the winter. And oftentimes, the individual plants, you can kind of think of them, they wind up connected together by runners or by rhizomes, which are very similar. They just run underneath the ground. And I kind of use, strawberry, again, not in this group, but you can kind of think how, multiple different little sections of strawberry connected by that runner. And club mosses really kind of do the very, very same thing. The roots of these tend to be really shallow. Again, that's something that you're very likely going to be seeing in a wet area. And rather than, out in a yard or in the landscape, you might see these more as a kind of a wet area in a forest rather than out in the open. Kind of an interesting thing about them, some of them are viviparous. That would mean that they basically give birth to live young. So the spores on the plant, again, we're still not into the seeded plants, will actually germinate on the plant and will form a whole new plant. And that breaks off and once it breaks off and falls to the ground, essentially will take root and start off a whole new plant. So rather than the spore or seed or something like that being what's moved, basically the new plant grows right on the old plant, breaks off or falls off, and then grows from there. So kind of an interesting thing that you see in some plants. Whisk ferns, again, not something you're commonly going to run into. There really are not a lot, no leaves and no roots. They have that same sort of rhizome-like structure underneath the ground. They're underground stems and stems from which the above ground parts just branch off of. And some of them, interestingly, have completely underground stages in their growth and development, where they are entirely underground and act like a saprophyte. So rather than photosynthesizing and getting their energy that way, they feed off of decomposing material that is down in the ground to get all of their nutrients. So kind of an interesting way that these plants can grow. You can see a picture, just kind of of those whisk ferns kind of growing out of some rocky soil there. Just kind of generally a really small plant, but again, a really interesting group. Now, one that we're going to be a lot more familiar with are going to be the ferns. This is a vascular plant that reproduces via spores. They do not have seeds or flowers. They have these really complex leaves. Generally, all sorts, the pinnate leaves with all of those, leaflets coming off of them, with some fascinating shapes in different groups of ferns. Most of them produce those coiled fiddleheads that will uncoil or expand into fronds. And if you watch the cooking channel a whole lot, eventually you'll run into just someone cooking with fiddleheads. So that's kind of an interesting thing there. But ferns work absolutely fantastically in the home landscape. They make wonderful potted plants or ornamental plants in containers that you can bring inside to kind of brighten up a room. They also make wonderful hanging plants and patios and porches and things like that. That's a big staghorn fern with really interesting leaves to it. Those can grow really prolifically and thrive for long periods of time. Another thing that ferns do really well is, if you have an area in your landscape that's kind of shaded, might get a fair bit of water, ferns make a really good ground cover. They make good plants to put in underneath trees, just to bring some nice green color and that interesting plant shape into the environment. They thrive really well in those conditions where you have shade, and oftentimes we are trying to find plants that work in that environment. The thing to remember about ferns, of course, they never do produce seeds. I want to go back to this image here for a second, the one in the top left, because I occasionally do get sent a picture of the underside of a fern where it's got these, kind of reddish colored rings on the bottom of the leaves. Those are the spore structures of the plant. That's how it reproduces. So those spores can join together to form a new fern. So there's nothing wrong with the plant. It's supposed to do that, but they won't have those what are called sori all the time. I did have a question there in the chat box about sensitive fern. I'm gonna have to look up that particular plant, just because I'm just not familiar with that name. But I will look that up for you and give you a little bit more information before we're done today. All right. So now we're getting into the conifers. Now these are going to be seed-bearing plants. We've taken another big leap forward in the development of plants, and conifers are, of course, um, a, a massive group of plants. They are massive not only in their in how broad, widespread they are, or how many species there are, but they can be individually quite massive. In fact, of course, the largest tree is the giant. You can have the argument over whether it is uh, uh, the giant sequoia or the redhead, but redwood. But both of those are conifers and are extraordinarily large trees. Um, Most of the conifers are going to have needle-shaped evergreen leaves. The seeds are going to be attached to the scales of a woody bracted cone. Of course, here in Mississippi, we always think of the pine cone as being the classic example there of the conifer. Conifers tend to be very abundant in cool, temperate regions. So as we get farther north into the boreal regions, the cooler forests and up higher in the elevations. But they're also found in tropical areas, and there can be a fantastic diversity of conifers in warmer areas and particularly in tropical mountains. And conifers, of course, are very important not only as timber. Of course, pine forestry here in Mississippi is a major industry, but also really important as ornamental species. So, just here are some examples, just some really some pretty conifers, and a lot of the conifers have that kind of narrow growth pattern to them, really tall, upright plants. But also keep in mind that we also have all sorts of examples like prostrate or creeping juniper that make wonderful ground covers. There is a good degree of variation in the colors of the needles, from that really kind of rich blue, dark greens, light greens. Just a lot of really interesting color variation that make them fantastic plants in the home landscape. Of course, again, just to get back to the kind of the primary thing that we think about when we think about conifers is that conifers have those cones, and their seeds are born inside that bracted cone, and that's really what we can use to define that group. Now, a group that often gets called a type of palm, cycads are in their own group. The classic example of these that we often have in the landscape is the sago palm, and they do superficially resemble a palm. They have those large compound leaves, they have a really thick trunk, and we do make use of them, particularly down here on the coast. People love sago palms for their yards. Um, they do produce cones. Their pollination is usually done by small bees or by beetles. And as that cone, which is going to be right in the center of the plant, which is quite a large one, it's going to open up and you're going to see those really big seeds that you see right up there in the top. So just an interesting plant, really sturdy plant that tolerates a lot of different conditions very well, and is for that reason really popular in home landscapes. Now, just to kind of include a little bit of different variation, of course, you have the sago palm, but in tropical environments, there are some other types of cycads that can get quite tall and have kind of a different growth habit. And certainly, if you look back into the fossil record, there are periods of time where the cycads were a really massive and an important group of plants. If you go back far enough into the history of the plants into the fossil record. All right, so the ginkgo or Ginkgophyta is a interesting group. It only has one living species in it. This is another one where if you go back a long period of time, there was more diversity. But now in the current year, there is only one extant species of this group, and that is Ginkgo biloba, which is popular in all sorts of. You'll see, sort of nutritional or medicinal products with ginkgo in them all the time, but also really popular as an ornamental plant. It is native to China, and we don't often see this in the landscape. But the male and female plant are separate, and the uh, the female plants do kind of produce an apricot-like seed that has a soft outer covering, and that covering does not smell good. So you really want to avoid using female trees in the home landscape. It's pretty unpleasant. The males just produce small flowers. You can see a picture of the little male flowers down there in the base. They fortunately don't have that unpleasant odor. And you can see a picture here on the right why ginkgo trees are so fantastic for the landscape. They have, of course, beautiful fan-shaped leaves. They can develop some wonderful fall color. And there are, interestingly, some dwarf varieties of ginkgo. You can see a picture of that over in the left. So there's a little bit of variation within the species and different varieties that are available to give you different uses for this plant in the landscape. All right, another group, the Gnetophytes, don't have a shorter name for this one. This is a small group. There's only 3 genera in it, or three genuses. They are gymnosperms. They have the naked seeds, just kind of like the same we would see for a conifer. Their vascular tissue is a little bit more like angiosperms. We'll talk about that soon. But there's some interesting groups within the Gnetophytes. One of them, I'm going to talk about 2 of these. One of them is Ephedra, or Ephedra, the Ephedra genus. One of these is called Mormon tea. It's a shrub you tend to find in desert environments. Has numerous sort of yellowish green branches. Both of the pictures up there at the top are of Ephedra. And they have paired bristle leaves that split, fall off fairly quickly. Kind of leaves a broom-like shrub. But they also have light yellow, sort of cone-shaped flowers on them. Most notably, ephedra is the source for ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, which are commonly used for sinus congestion, and unfortunately for some other things that we don't want to talk about too much. But that is sort of the native source for that. Another really good example of the Gnetophytes. There is Welwitschia mirabilis. They call it a living fossil. You can see a picture down there at the base. Now, the 2 cotyledon leaves, the 2 initial leaves that come out of the seed, give rise to just 2 true leaves. And the plant only ever has those 2 leaves. And those 2 leaves will continue to grow throughout the life of that plant, kind of giving you that interesting appearance that you see down there at the bottom. They are native to the desert in Africa. So kind of just a really interesting plant that has a growth habit that's really unlike anything else that you're likely to see. All right, so now we're going to finally get to the Magnoliophyta, or the flowering plants. And we group those down into 2 different groups, the monocotyledonous plants and the dicotyledonous plants. And that really comes down to, the name comes from how many seed leaves. Cotyledon is going to mean their seed leaf. And of course, the monocotyledonous plants have 1, and the dicotyledonous plants have 2. And there's some other differences between these two groups that we're going to very briefly talk about. So one of the easiest ways to tell a monocot from a dicot, and first of all, that is much easier to say than monocotyledonous and dicotyledonous. So from here on, I'm just going to say monocot and dicot, and I know we'll all know what we're talking about. A monocot will have parallel leaf veins. So when you look at the leaf of a monocot, all of the veins of the leaf are going to run the length of that plant, of that leaf. And generally there will be a thick midrib in there, and then all of the veins running the length of the leaf. Whereas in dicots, you have a net-like pattern of veins. So you have that central vein of the leaf, and then branches coming off of there. And you can see a pretty good image of that here to kind of give you an idea of the difference. There are some differences in sort of the internal structure of the plant as well. And that is principally, and this is for the stem, the arrangement of the vascular tissue inside that stem. For a monocot, it's just kind of it kind of seems randomly arranged. You have the bundles of xylem and phloem cells just kind of scattered in amongst the tissue of the plant. In dicots, it's in that ring around the outside with the xylem and phloem cells in those groups kind of neatly arranged, rather than kind of scattered out within the structure of the plant. Generally speaking, the monocots and dicots tend to have different structures of their root system. So monocots have a fibrous root system. You can see a picture there on the left where all of those thread-like roots kind of all go out in different directions. Very often, because they don't send one strong root down like you often see in the dicots, you'll often see a number of strong roots right at the base that we call prop roots that kind of serve to stabilize the plant there at the base. Dicots, on the other hand, tend to have that taproot that goes down, and kind of the same idea. It kind of branches off of that taproot. Often that taproot will go away at some point, leaving those, leaving the shallower roots there. But that you can see kind of just a good image here of the difference between the arrangements of roots between monocots on the left and dicots on the right. When we look at the flowers of monocots and dicots, there is one thing that we can look at that kind of gives us a quick tool to tell the difference. When we look at monocots, we tend to see flower arrangements that are in threes or multiples of threes. So you can see a monocot there on the left, whereas with dicots, we tend to have multiples of either 4 or 5. So you can see the example of the dicot there on the right. We also have a difference in the growth habit of the plants. And not to get too far into this, but dicots as a rule are always going to have their growing tip of the plant right at the end of the plant, or at the terminal. We call it that apical meristem. Now, some monocots are going to have what we call an intercalary meristem. That's a growth part of the plant that's down at the base of the plant rather than up at the top. So that gives us a kind of an interesting thing that we can think about. If we had dicots growing as our lawns rather than monocots, like a grass, we would only be able to mow it once, because once we mowed it and removed that apical meristem off the top, the grass would stop growing. It wouldn't grow any taller. Because our grass is a monocot, we can keep mowing that grass, and it has that meristem lower than where we're cutting, so it's going to continue to send up those shoots of grass. So here are some common families that we would see in the group of the monocots. One very popular one is the Ericaceae, all of the palms. You can see an example of that up in the very top right. And these, just not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about families of monocots or families of dicots, but I do want to just mention a few, and hopefully I'll be able to come back and kind of spend some time on these for a future presentation. Other monocot families we might find in our home landscape are going to include the lilies, so the Liliaceae, amaryllis, which is popular as a landscape plant and as a container plant for homes and holiday plants. All of the irises are also in this group, and of course, and the orchids, another beautiful flower that we can find in the monocots. And most significantly, probably in terms of just human civilization, all of the grasses fall into the family Poaceae, Poaceae and Gramineaceae. And that would be a large number of the crops that we grow for food throughout the world are going to fall into this monocot group. So things like wheat and barley are all going to be monocots. So really important food source and really important to agriculture. Of course, the other grasses fall into the Poaceae and the monocots as well. So also all of those ornamental grasses that we enjoy in our landscapes. Some common dicot families, and I admit as I was doing this, when I first started off, I had this long list of families of dicots, and I kind of had to keep narrowing it down just so that I didn't spend too much time just listing off a bunch of different families. But the Asteraceae include the daisies, other plants, other similar flowers. As a vegetable guy, I appreciate the Brassicaceae. That's the mustard family, but that's going to include things like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. Fabaceae is going to be the peas and beans, legumes. Though there are some plants that we group in with the legumes that aren't peas, but those are going to be pod-bearing plants. The Lamiaceae would be mint. You can generally tell those apart because they tend to have kind of a square stem to them. There's the Ranunculaceae or the buttercups, the roses or Rosaceae, the Rutaceae, so that would include citrus, and the Solanaceae, which includes both plants like Datura and really interesting ornamental plants, as well as a lot of vegetables like tomatoes and eggplants and peppers all fall within the Solanaceae. So the value of knowing the family of the plant really allows you to kind of make some generalizations about the plant. It allows you to group plants together because they tend to have a fairly similar growth habit, a fairly similar pattern of flowering. So if you know a few of the families that you're common to run into, and if you know two plants are in similar families, you can generally make some guesses about how they're going to interact in the environment and work in the environment. Not always going to be true because families are still quite a large grouping, but it's a good way to approach it. So there are some other ways that we talk about different plants. We talk about plants by their growth habit. So whether they're annuals, so they complete their entire life cycle in one season, from germination, from seed, all the way through growth and flowering, then senescence, and the seed start up the next year as a completely new generation. We also have biennials. Those are going to complete their life cycle across 2 years. So in the first year, they produce a rosette of growth. You can see that in the bottom left there. In the second year, they're going to send up that shoot with flowers on it. I've used bull thistle as an example because if you drive around Mississippi, you're very likely to see it at some point as a really good example of a biennial. And then, of course, we have the perennials. They're going to persist over several years and have vegetative and sexual production over both methods are potentially possible. You can see the root system there for perennial plants. can be quite extensive because they've been there for quite a while. It can spread out quite large. So one of the advantages of those perennial plants is they can stick around a good bit longer for us. So things we want to think about when we're trying to identify plants. Can we tell, is it a monocot or a dicot? Is it a conifer? Can we look at some of the features of that plant and put it into a broad group? And from there, we can kind of work to narrow it down. If we know the growth habit of the plant, being able to tell that, that's going to be able, going to allow us to narrow it down just a little bit further. Is it a tall plant? Is it growing as a rosette? Are we seeing flowers on the plant? Is it, sending out runners or rhizomes to propagate? Are all really good characteristics that'll help us in making an identification of the plant. So I can tell that I am going to run far out of time. I'm just going to talk very quickly about some identification stuff. And again, we're going to be able to pick this back up a little bit in future presentations to be able to go into a little bit more detail. But when we're trying to identify a grass, there are some features we're looking for. We're going to look at the leaf blade. We're going to look at the outside of that leaf blade and see if it has any features. We're going to look and see if the midrib, what qualities of midrib, if it's right in the center, if it's offset. And then we're going to look at particularly at something called the ligule, the auricle, and then the margins. And so here are the parts of a grass plant. So the ligule, if you pull back one of the leaves from the stem of the grass, that ligule is right there. And it might be membranous, it might be hairy, or it might not be there. And we use that as a way to identify grasses. We also have the sort of the borders of that leaf wrapping around the stem. And those could be quite long, they could be short, or they could not be there also. So these are, again, all features that we use in the identification of grasses. So sometimes we're grouping grasses into different groups. So you may have sedges that have sort of a triangular cross section of their stem. Leaves are arranged in three. Nut sedge is the classic example there. Grass stems can either be round or flat. And then we have rushes that have hollow stems. When we're talking about broadleaves, identification of broadleaf plants, we can try to do that from the cotyledon, but after years of trying, that is not always an easy thing to do. Oftentimes we are looking at the older leaves and their shape and their arrangement. So all sorts of different structures of leaves. The big one to remember is whether the leaves are arranged on the stem alternate, so you can see the picture there, where they're alternating back and forth which direction they go. If they're opposite, so they're coming off the stem just opposite of each other. And then whorled, where you have more than two leaves coming off at each of those sections. And then there are a vast number of different names for the shapes of leaves. And I would like to say that I am sharp enough to have remembered all of these, but frankly, I just keep a picture file up of the names of all of the different shapes that you can possibly use. And I pick up the leaf and I kind of match it to the picture as an easy way to kind of help me with identification. Similarly for leaf margin, because there's just a lot of different shapes that you can possibly have. I keep this as a reference. So when I'm looking at a description of a plant and it says that it has a denticulate leaf, I can kind of look down the list of these and go, okay, denticulate means it has those really fine sort of spikes on the edges. Ciliate would mean that it has little hairs coming off. So, there's absolutely no shame in keeping these sort of images as a way to use this and come back to it as a reference when you're trying to identify a plant. Also keep in mind, we're always going to look at the flowers Does the plant have both male and female flowers? Some do. Some plants have flowers that are perfect, that are male and female. Some have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Some have flowers that are female on one plant and male flowers on an entirely different plant. And that's just another tool that we use in the process of plant identification. Practically speaking, one of the best tools we can use is flower color and shape. It's one of the first things I'm going to ask for is can I get a picture of the flower, because that's an easy way. We can look at the arrangement of the petals, the number of petals on the plant will really help with identification. And again, oftentimes I may not know the species or even the genus, but most of the time the families tend to have kind of a common flower structure. And so I can look at that and go, okay, well, I don't know exactly what genus it is, but I'm pretty sure it's in this particular family just from the shape of the flower. So there are some really good resources that we can use for plant identification, some databases, some things we can access online. One of these is the Plants National Database that the USDA maintains. There are some pictures on there. That information is extraordinarily reliable and it's searchable. So you can look up the common name of a plant and you can kind of see if it matches what you're looking at. I'm going to skip one. I'm going to go back to it. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has some excellent resources on plant identification, as well as some really great resources on growing those plants if that's what you're interested in doing. There's a really good weed identification guide that you can access through Virginia Tech. And of course, MSU has some weed guides as well. You can access the invasive plants of the eastern US. So if it's an invasive plant, you can get some good information about it there. And I know I'm going through this rather quickly. I will have my slides all put up in the Google Drive for you to be able to access this so you can get those links. Don't forget, there are a lot of books out there that are really good for plant identification. Some excellent wildflower books, really excellent books on weeds. I know we've talked about weeds of southern turf grasses and weeds of the South previously. I always keep a copy of Native Trees of the Southeast on my bookshelf because they're really reliable books that I use fairly frequently. And there are some really great area-specific books for wildflowers of this particular state, trees of this particular state, that make up really good resources for you to use as a tool for plant identification. And a lot of times using identification in those books, we're just kind of flipping through and looking for the one that matches what we're looking at out in the field. Of course, the other thing you can do is you can use your county extension agent wherever you are as a tool in plant identification. You can bring in plant samples. If it is a small plant, please bring me more than one. That will kind of give me an idea if there's any variation. That one that you brought in was just kind of a weird looking one. Bring me flowers or seeds if at all possible. That's going to make it a lot easier for me to identify them. If you have it at different growth stages, that's wonderful. I don't expect that to always be the case. Failing bringing me an actual plant, pictures are great. Generally speaking, I'm going to need more than one. So a picture, I'm actually using the example of pictures that were sent to me for plant identification. So, show me sort of the overall view of the plant. If there's something that particularly stands out, like leaf shape or stem shape, take a picture of that. If you can pull it up, let me look at the root system, seeds and flowers if you can, any other thing like that. And really importantly, some notes about where it's growing are going to be really important in trying to do that identification. So I want to go back and I want to actually look at one of these identification sites. So I'm going to keep sharing my screen, but I'm going to pull up this site, Southeastern Florida, because this is often a site that I use when I am identifying plants for people. And so I thought it would be a good one to be able to show you, because it has a really good system for being able to just kind of narrow down what you might be looking for. So we can go to identify specimen over here in the corner. And the first thing that we're going to look at is flower colors. So we're going to say we're looking for a plant that has a purple flower. And is it a tree or a shrub? Is it a vine or a herb or graminid? And if you need to, you can always pull up the glossary, and that is going to give you the definitions of these terms, so that you kind of know exactly what it is you might be looking for, and you can see that there's a kind of a good pattern, good pictures of things to really guide you through this identification process. So what, is it a herb? We'll say we'll say it's a herb that has compound leaves that are in a whorled arrangement, and we'll say it's a dicot. And so we can just hit search. I pulled a bunch of random things, and by chance it only brought up one possible example, which is this Anemone caroliniana. And then really importantly for me, it has all of these pictures that really make it easy to compare what I'm looking at to the description of that particular plant. And then if I got a description wrong, I can go back and search there, and then it will give me a different example of what I might be looking at. So a really useful tool for plant identification. There are a lot of other really useful tools as well. Just to show you the USDA site very quickly, you can go right there, and you can always tell that I've gone to this site quite a lot. They always have a plant of the week. That's always a interesting one, or you can see a list of plants in my state. So if I want to see all of the plants of Mississippi, I can do that. That's going to be a really long list, but you can see all of those plants that are listed for Mississippi. Really interesting that way. But you also, particularly, sometimes somebody will give me a common name. You can look up live oak and put that under common name, and that'll bring up all of the different plants that are listed as live oaks. You can find the one that you're particularly talking about, and it will give you a really great description of that plant, including where it grows, all sorts of characteristics. There's even a plant guide that is going to give you more information about that. Hopefully that'll load here in just a second. So all sorts of information will be pulled up, a full description, related species, hybrids, adaptation, and uses. Of course, uses for gardeners is going to be really important because that's, how would we use this plant in the home landscape? So thank you very much for being part. I know this is a kind of a different style of presentation, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, if you're on YouTube, congratulations on making it to the end of the video. If you have any questions, put those down in the comments. And if you're here with me today, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have once I stop sharing. All right, any questions from anybody?